A passenger elbowed a black CEO and sneered, "You people should stand." But when the CEO rose with his legal team, the whole plane went silent. He thought an elbow to the face would keep a man in his place. He didn't realize the one he struck built empires from the ground he tried to own. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always ends in consequence. A sharp elbow cracked against Adrian Corr's nose. The sound was sickening, wet, sudden, wrong. A flash of white pain burst behind his eyes, and then the warmth of blood trickling down his upper lip reminded him it wasn't a dream. The hum of the cabin seemed to pause. For a moment, even the engines felt like they held their breath. Adrian didn't speak. He blinked hard, steadying his vision as the sting spread across his face like fire behind a cracked window. A passenger had struck him, openly, deliberately. The man, now settling in the adjacent seat, wore a worn leather jacket and a crooked smile that didn't belong to someone who had made a mistake. "You people always take up space that isn't yours," the man had muttered moments earlier, pushing past with deliberate force. Now he leaned back with a smirk, dropping into his seat as if nothing had happened. The overhead light above him buzzed faintly. A flight attendant nearby froze, lips parting slightly as though she might say something, but she didn't. No one did. The silence grew heavier than the altitude. Adrian slowly lifted a napkin from the seat pocket in front of him. His hand was calm, too calm, as though suppressing a storm beneath skin and bone. He dabbed at the blood carefully, his breathing measured, controlled. The napkin soaked red within seconds. His eyes remained on the man beside him, tall, unshaven, a coiled arrogance in every gesture. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he threw another dagger disguised as words. "You people should stand." He said it casually, almost lazily, as if he were commenting on the weather. A few rows ahead, a child stopped laughing. Further back, someone shifted in their seat, but the murmur of everyday conversation never returned. The air had changed, sharp now, colder somehow. Adrian turned his head slightly. The taste of blood sat on his tongue like metal. He studied the man beside him, not in rage, but in analysis. Every detail mattered now. His fingers tapped gently against the edge of the tablet still resting on his tray table, an instinctive movement. His mind, however, had already left the confines of the aircraft. It was elsewhere, racing, unraveling this moment into a sequence of calculated next steps. He knew better than to strike back. Not here, not now, not like this. The flight attendant finally moved, stepping into the aisle with hesitation. "Sir, do you need assistance?" Her voice cracked slightly, her eyes darting between the two men. Adrian didn't answer immediately. He folded the bloodied napkin once, then again, and placed it carefully on the tray. His suit sleeve now bore a faint smear of red. He didn't bother to clean it. "I'm fine," he said quietly. "But you should call your supervisor." The attendant blinked. We'd prefer to keep things calm until takeoff." Adrian looked at her, not unkindly, but with a firmness that suggested experience with people who tried to soften storms into inconveniences. "This isn't turbulence," he said. "This is violence." The man beside him, still smug, still silent, reached for the safety card in front of him as though the moment were already behind them. Adrian's hands remained still, resting on his lap, but his thoughts churned. His name was Adrian Corr, founder and CEO of Virelon Technologies, a company known not just for innovation, but for precision. He was a man who had built from nothing and understood the weight of restraint. The elbow may have broken the surface, but beneath that surface, Adrian was already reconstructing everything. Across the aisle, a man with a trimmed beard and quiet demeanor glanced over. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered on Adrian longer than most. Unspoken recognition passed between them, unformed and quiet. Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge had just pulled away. Inside, the tension was now part of the air itself. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Flight 137 from Darren City to New York is now cleared for departure. Flight time approximately 2 hours. Please ensure all seat belts are securely fastened. The woman across the row adjusted her tray table with unnecessary clatter, as though noise could cover discomfort. Adrian pressed a second napkin gently beneath his nose. His fingers were steadier now. His posture hadn't changed since the strike. He didn't press the call button again. He didn't demand justice in that moment. He did what he always did. He observed. He gathered. He waited. The lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft taxied forward. Harlan Doss, still oblivious to what he had triggered, reclined in his seat and closed his eyes with the satisfied breath of a man who believed himself untouchable. He didn't notice Adrian glance down at his wristband, the discreet Virellon prototype model that never stopped recording ambient data. Behind Adrian's silence, a different kind of power was awakening. No cameras had caught the moment. No flight attendant had intervened. No one stood, but Adrian would, not with rage, with something sharper. As the wheels lifted from the tarmac and the city shrank beneath the clouds, Adrian turned his head slightly toward the man beside him. Blood still stained the napkin, but his voice, when it finally returned, was steady and exact. "You've just started something you won't understand." The elbow struck with a sound that shouldn't have belonged in the quiet hum of an airplane cabin. A sharp, wet crack followed by the low gasp of air being sucked in by nearby passengers. Adrian Core didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly, eyes momentarily shutting as pain bloomed through the bridge of his nose and down into his throat. Blood dripped into his palm, warm and sharp-smelling. Harlan Doss had already sunk into the window seat beside him, smug and relaxed, as if nothing had happened. "Sir, please calm down. Let's de-escalate," came the voice of the head flight attendant, his tone mechanical and practiced. He was a tall, clean-shaven man with hollow concern in his eyes and a name tag that read Martin. He didn't even look directly at Adrian as he spoke. Adrian looked up slowly, blood still seeping from his nostrils. His expression was unreadable, calm to the point of chilling. He did not raise his voice. He didn't demand justice or shout accusations. He simply turned his gaze from the attendant to Harlan, who now reclined with the smugness of someone certain he'd get away with it. "I'd like to file an incident report," Adrian said, his voice level, controlled. Martin shook his head slightly, uncomfortable. "We're in the air, sir. This seems like a misunderstanding between passengers. Let's wait until we land." Adrian turned away without another word. He reached for the napkin on the tray, folded it methodically, and pressed it under his nose. The blood stained the white fabric slowly, spreading like a bloom. Harlan let out a soft chuckle and murmured something under his breath, just loud enough for Adrian to hear but quiet enough to avoid detection. Adrian didn't reply. His thoughts were already shifting into motion. His right wrist flicked subtly. A small, almost imperceptible vibration confirmed what he already knew. His wristband, part of Virellon Technology's latest prototype, had been recording from the moment the flight began. Cabin audio, positional telemetry, biometric data, everything had been passively synced. He didn't need to shout. He already had the truth, and it was time-stamped. Silently, he lifted his tablet from the seat pocket and opened the camera. With calm, precise movements, he began documenting the scene. A photo of his bleeding nose, another of the seat row number etched into the armrest, one of the in-flight screens showing the current altitude and time. Finally, he turned the camera slightly and captured Martin's indifferent expression as the flight attendant turned to walk away without filing any report. Across the aisle, a man shifted in his seat. Elias Crane, mid-30s, quiet eyes, short beard. He'd boarded early, not because he needed the time, but because he liked observing the slow ritual of strangers filling confined spaces. He hadn't expected this. He recognized Adrian Core almost immediately. He had read an article about him just weeks ago, a tech leader who rarely made public appearances but whose AI innovations had transformed sectors like education and healthcare. Elias watched closely. He noticed the way Adrian moved, not panicked, not shaken, strategic, deliberate, like someone more familiar with boardroom wars than physical ones. And yet, there was something simmering beneath that silence. Not anger, but intent. Harlan adjusted his jacket, glanced at Adrian, and smirked. "You people always take up space that isn't yours," he muttered. Adrian didn't react. Not outwardly, but something in his eyes shifted, narrowing slightly. He made no move to stand. Instead, he leaned back, his body calm but his mind already constructing the first chess move. He wasn't just reacting. He was building something. A case. A reckoning. Something that would leave this flight far from ordinary. Another flight attendant passed by, this one younger, clearly nervous. Adrian asked again, "Is anyone taking an official record of this?" The attendant paused, unsure. "I think Martin is handling it, sir." "No one has written anything down," Adrian replied. His voice remained quiet, almost gentle, but the weight behind it made the young attendant stiffen. Still, nothing was documented. Behind them, a few passengers turned back to their screens or books. Others whispered quietly. No one stood up. No one asked questions. The silence was growing thick, not with peace, but with fear of involvement. Adrian leaned forward slightly, breathing carefully through his mouth now. His nose had stopped bleeding, but the ache remained, a dull reminder of how quickly dignity can be assaulted in public without consequence. He didn't touch his cufflinks again. Instead, he scrolled through the flight's network, noting every time-stamped ping the aircraft made, every publicly available log. He cross-referenced it with his own system, knowing it would corroborate the cabin's stability. No turbulence, no jolt. Only an elbow. A deliberate one. The camera above them blinked faintly. Inactive, or so it appeared. He tapped a note into his tablet. Request raw cabin footage from internal logs. If denied, issue subpoena. Harlan leaned back once more, crossed his legs, and muttered, "Let's see if he still walks like a king when we land." Adrian didn't turn to look at him. He was already somewhere else, in strategy, in motion, in consequence. Across the aisle, Elias reached into his pocket, turned on the voice memo feature on his phone, and set it face down on the armrest. His hands trembled slightly, but his gaze remained firm. No one spoke for the next hour. The clouds outside drifted by in silence, and within Adrian's mind, a new narrative had begun to take form, not of victimhood, but of exposure. Sometimes silence prepares the storm, Adrian thought. The wheels struck the runway with a jolt that rippled through the fuselage. Adrian Core sat upright, the napkin still pressed against his nose, now soaked with fading streaks of blood. His cuff was dotted crimson, the only evidence of the violence that had unfolded midair, evidence, at least, that anyone besides his wristband could see. As the engines throttled down and the cabin filled with the usual rustling of passengers preparing to disembark, Adrian remained still, calm on the surface, calculating beneath it. Before the plane even reached the gate, 2 ground personnel boarded swiftly, too swiftly. One of them, wearing an airline-issued blazer and a brittle smile, scanned the aisle until his eyes locked with Adrian's. No stretcher, no paramedics, just 2 men in suits whose posture screamed control, not concern. "Mr. Core," the lead one said, adjusting his badge which read Senior Operations Manager, Vincent Hale. "I understand there was an incident on board. We'd like to handle this matter internally." Quickly and with discretion, Adrian didn't move. He studied Vincent's carefully polished expression, the kind of face built not for empathy but for minimizing scandal. Behind them, Harlan Doss stood in the aisle, stretching exaggeratedly and muttering under his breath, "Must be hard getting used to the ground when you think you're above it." A low chuckle followed from a nearby passenger. Adrian finally rose, steady despite the dull throb in his face. "I'd like to file a police report," he said evenly. Vincent's mask cracked just slightly. "Sir, there's really no need to escalate things. We've reviewed the situation. It seems like a misunderstanding. No need for public attention. These things happen." Adrian turned to face him directly. "This wasn't turbulence. This was assault. I understand you're upset." "I'm not upset," Adrian interrupted, voice low but razor-sharp. "I'm documenting." Vincent blinked. "Let's be realistic, Mr. Kaur. People are watching. It reflects better on everyone if this stays contained. We're prepared to offer medical assistance, a voucher, and—" "I'm not here for vouchers," Adrian said, reaching for the medical consent form a crew member tried to hand him. He took a pen from his pocket and signed it without looking, as if it were routine. "I'm here for accountability." As the engines cooled and the jet bridge locked into place, the cabin door opened, revealing paramedics who were finally allowed to board, but only after the ground team had finished their pitch. Adrian glanced at the arriving medics, then back at Vincent. "Where were they 10 minutes ago?" he asked. Vincent cleared his throat. "Protocol." Across the aisle, Harlan Doss was still chuckling, leaning toward another man in business casual. "He's used to privilege," he whispered just loudly enough. "Let's see him stand in line like the rest." Adrian didn't respond. He didn't need to. His wristband, linked to Viralon's own neural AI framework, had been passively recording since boarding. Ambient audio, time-stamped logs, even visual snapshots through his lens-embedded smart frames. The angle, lighting, and voice levels were all optimal. The recording would be pristine, unforgiving. As Adrian stepped into the narrow aisle, passengers parted but looked away, their eyes avoiding his face, his blood, his dignity. They shifted nervously, the kind of silence that forms when people sense they've witnessed something wrong but are too afraid, or too indifferent, to say anything. Outside, the boarding tunnel was colder than expected. A sharp wind sliced through the exposed gap as Adrian emerged, flanked by paramedics. One of them, a young man in his 20s with nervous hands, tried to ask him basic questions about pain levels and vision. Adrian answered each one quietly but clearly. He wanted no confusion in the report. Behind him, Vincent followed closely, still trying. "Mr. Kaur, a public case benefits no one. These kinds of incidents, once viral, spiral out of proportion. I've seen careers derailed." Adrian turned. His voice was soft, nearly a whisper. "Yours might be one of them." Vincent's face stiffened. "You're not thinking rationally." "This is an overreaction." Adrian took out his tablet with a blood-streaked hand, swiped to a folder labeled Cabin 4A, 6:41 a.m., and held up the screen. A frozen still of Harlan's elbow connecting with his face. The smirk, the blood, the flight time, audio bars lining the bottom of the playback. "You don't know what I'm thinking," Adrian said. "But you will." Paramedics gestured him forward toward the terminal corridor where a medical room was being prepared. But before moving, Adrian paused at the threshold. He looked back through the glass door. There was Harlan again, arms crossed, leaning against the window, eyes dancing with cruel amusement. Their gazes met for a second time. The smirk returned. Adrian didn't flinch. He exhaled, not from pain, but from purpose. Then he said it, quiet enough for only Vincent to hear. "I'm not here to settle. I'm here to demonstrate consequence." By the next morning, the bruising beneath Adrian Kaur's eye had deepened, spreading like a slow storm across his cheekbone. But he didn't wince. He sat in the Virelon Technologies executive briefing room, lit by quiet beams of winter sun cutting through the tall glass windows. His head counsel, Dorian Merrick, stood across from him, sleeves rolled to the elbow, eyes narrowed behind his thin-rimmed glasses as he scrolled through the synced cabin data on a secured tablet. "This isn't just an assault," Dorian said finally. voice low and edged with something dangerous. "It's negligence and complicity. Listen to this." He tapped the screen, playing back a snippet of audio from Adrian's wristband. The voice of the lead flight attendant echoed crisply through the speakers. "Let's not escalate anything. If he's calm, let's move on." The silence that followed was worse than denial. Adrian leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin, gaze pinned to the waveform as it pulsed across the screen. "He watched me bleed and chose convenience," Adrian said. His voice was steady, but something beneath it coiled like wire. "I want this handled properly. But I want them to underestimate us first." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "So, we don't go public yet?" "Not yet," Adrian replied. "Let them believe it's business as usual." That afternoon, the airline's communications team issued a public statement through their press liaison. It framed the altercation as an unfortunate but minor incident related to turbulence-induced contact. The language was clean, sterile, deliberately vague. But it couldn't mask the inconsistency. Social media didn't take long to notice. By evening, aviation forums and flight tracking enthusiasts dissected the turbulence claim like vultures over a carcass. Public flight logs revealed a smooth cruising altitude with no reported weather anomalies. Someone even posted a screen recording from a passenger who had taken a photo of their untouched in-flight beverage. Mid-air, no spill. The post went viral under the caption, "Turbulence." "My orange juice begs to differ." Adrian didn't respond to the media requests that poured in. Not yet. The silence was tactical. That evening, in his office, the lights dimmed to a cool amber. Adrian sat alone reviewing the compiled timestamps from the incident. Every motion, every comment, every indifferent glance from the crew had been logged by his ambient recorder. But data alone wasn't enough. He needed corroboration. Human, not just digital. That's when he remembered the quiet man across the aisle. Adrian opened his secure messaging console and typed with precision. "Mr. Crane, I believe you were seated across from me on Flight 4173. I think you saw more than most people heard." The cursor blinked in the silence. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Adrian began to close the message window when the reply arrived. "I did," Elias Crane wrote, "and I have something you might need. A recording." Adrian blinked, then read the line again. A faint smile broke across his otherwise reserved expression. It wasn't triumph, it was recognition. This was the pivot, the fulcrum. In that moment, he knew the balance of power had shifted. Elias Crane wasn't just a witness. He was a turning point. He leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders slowly unraveling as he stared out the window. Outside, the city shimmered under a layer of frost and low cloud. He had been elbowed, humiliated, and dismissed, but he had also documented, endured, and prepared. And now, the silence that once threatened to swallow the truth had become an amplifier. "They thought they were silencing me," Adrian murmured to himself, the words calm but weighted. "They were amplifying me." 2 days later, Adrian stepped through the courthouse doors flanked by his legal team, the sharp autumn wind curling through the glass vestibule behind him. The swelling in his nose had subsided slightly, but the bruising remained, casting a violet hue beneath his left eye, a silent echo of the assault. Cameras clicked in the distance beyond the courthouse plaza, muffled by the building's thick walls. Inside, the air was cooler, more controlled, but tension ran just as sharp. His posture didn't flinch. Every movement was deliberate, a quiet contrast to the anxious energy around him. The airline's legal team was already present, seated confidently near the front. Vincent Hale, polished in a tailored gray suit, turned and gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His team, composed of stiff-collared attorneys and in-house executives, carried thick binders and false confidence. They believed Adrian would fold, accept a quiet settlement, perhaps a formal apology crafted by a PR firm, and let the story drift from the news cycle before it gained any real weight. Hale leaned back in his chair, arms casually crossed, and whispered something to the man beside him, who chuckled lightly. Their smugness hung in the room like cologne. Adrian didn't look at them. He took his seat calmly beside his counsel, Dorian Merrick, who opened his leather case with the ease of a man sharpening a blade. Elias Crane sat 2 rows behind, hands folded, his phone held tightly in one palm. He wasn't officially part of the legal team, but his presence carried weight. The pre-hearing opened with procedural remarks, but the atmosphere shifted when Dorian stood. "Your Honor," he began, voice clear and poised, "this case is not merely about a physical altercation. It is about a systemic failure, intentional disregard for passenger dignity, and willful corporate complicity." He handed a packet to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. Inside were copies of internal airline memos, documents Dorian had uncovered just the night before. Typed in the sterile language of liability management, they instructed crew members to avoid escalation with VIP-class passengers, even if conflict occurred. The key line read, "In case of dispute, do not engage or reprimand. Protect brand optics. Minimize incident documentation unless unavoidable." The judge scanned the first few pages, brow tightening. "Are you asserting the crew was ordered not to act in response to violence?" he asked, glancing up. "Yes, Your Honor," Dorian replied, stepping forward, "and that this protocol directly contributed to the failure to assist Mr. Core when he was physically assaulted." Before the airline's counsel could respond, Dorian introduced a new piece of evidence, Elias Crane's audio recording. With permission, it played aloud in the courtroom. The sound was unmistakable. Harlan's voice, laced with contempt, "You people should stand," followed by laughter. The cabin noise, the silence of the crew, the sharp intake of breath that followed Adrian's injury, it all painted a picture that could no longer be brushed aside as a misunderstanding. A hush fell over the courtroom. Vincent Hale's expression shifted. His fingers clenched into the armrests as he leaned over to his lead attorney and whispered something urgent. Meanwhile, the airline's spokesperson, seated at the end of the defense bench, tapped his tablet nervously. The mood had changed. Their narrative, one of overreaction and turbulence, was unraveling. The judge adjusted his glasses and spoke with deliberate weight. "Based on this evidence, I am ordering an emergency review of the airline's ethics board and internal policies." From the defense bench, Harlan Doss sat frozen. His face, once smug, had lost all color. He looked not at Adrian but toward the corner of the courtroom, as if hoping an exit would open in the wall. Behind him, 2 airline representatives whispered quickly, one shaking his head. The other subtly slid his chair an inch away from Harlan. In the middle of it all, Adrian remained composed. His breathing was steady, his hands folded on the table. When Vincent Hale finally turned to him, muttering just loud enough to be heard over the murmur of the courtroom, the words carried more desperation than threat. "You're making a mistake. This could be career suicide." Adrian didn't flinch. His voice, quiet but unshakable, cut through the tension like a blade. He leaned slightly forward and met Hale's eyes without hesitation. "I built mine from nothing. Let's see what you build from this." The judge struck his gavel once, declaring the session adjourned until the full hearing date. But no one stood immediately. Reporters in the hallway were already positioning themselves for interviews. A ripple moved through the gallery, witnesses, court clerks, and spectators, some stunned by the developments, others already speculating what this meant for the industry at large. As Adrian rose from his seat, the weight of silence followed him. Not the silence of fear or defeat, but the charged stillness that comes just before a reckoning. Outside, clouds gathered over the city like the prelude to a storm. But inside that courthouse, something larger had already begun. The air had shifted. A single elbow may have sparked it, but what followed would shake the very ground on which silence had long stood. The court wasn't just listening to words now. It was listening to history. The courtroom lights burned hot overhead, casting sharp reflections off the polished wood and metal railings. The atmosphere was tense, electrified, as murmurs passed like static through the audience. A clerk's voice echoed crisply across the chamber. "All rise." Adrian Corr stepped through the double doors as if entering a boardroom, not a battlefield. He wore a dark navy suit, precise and uncreased, the fabric catching the light with subdued authority. His gaze swept the room without rush, but with intention. Protesters outside had already drawn cameras. Inside, those cameras now turned toward him. Flashes popped. The silence wasn't respect, it was pressure, and Adrian walked straight into it. At the front bench, Dorian Merrick rose, adjusting his tie with the ease of someone who thrived under scrutiny. Calm but coiled, he turned to face the court. "Your Honor, this case isn't about one elbow," he began, voice clear and unhurried. "It's about every silent nod that allowed it." A ripple went through the gallery, just enough to remind everyone that this wasn't a private arbitration. This was public reckoning. On the opposing side, Harlan Doss kept his head lowered, his once arrogant posture now slouched beneath the tailored bulk of his suit. The corporate lawyers surrounding him barely looked his way. It was a performance of allegiance. Tight suits, briefcases snapped open, but none of it felt grounded. Adrian watched as Harlan's fingers twitched against the table, restless, exposed. The judge nodded to Dorian. "Proceed." Adrian's legal team cued the footage. First came the cabin video, grainy but clear enough. The courtroom watched in frozen silence as the sequence unfolded. Harlan stepping into frame, the elbow driving into Adrian's face, the splatter of red as he leaned back. Then the smirk. That slow, deliberate smirk. Murmurs turned into gasps. "Pause," Dorian said softly. The screen froze on Adrian's bloodied face. "Now listen." Audio began playing, low at first, then rising. The court heard Vincent Hale's voice, calm and rehearsed. "We'll handle this internally, sir." No need for public attention. Another clip played seconds later. This time, Harlan's voice, sharp and smug. "You people should stand." Someone in the gallery let out an audible breath, a slow exhale of disbelief. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Harlan, in contrast, flinched as the words echoed around him, his own voice now a weapon turned inward. His defense attorney whispered something in his ear, but Harlan didn't react. He had no script for this. Then came Harlan's defense, weak, brittle. "I didn't mean to cause harm," he said, finally raising his head. "There was turbulence. I lost my balance." Dorian didn't interrupt. He simply walked to the center of the courtroom, clicked a remote, and brought up the flight telemetry report. "No turbulence," he said, tapping the timestamp. "Not even a bump." There was no grand reveal, just the quiet unraveling of a lie. But the moment that cut deeper than any evidence came next. Dorian turned to the witness bench and called, "Elias Crane to the stand." Adrian watched Elias rise from the gallery. The quiet man moved with steady steps, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his phone. He was unassuming, yet the weight of the truth he carried gave him gravity. Sworn in, Elias sat down, adjusted the mic, and took a breath. "I was seated across from Mr. Corr," Elias began. "I saw the entire incident. I heard the comment Dorian asked gently, 'Can you play the recording from your phone?' Elias unlocked it, found the file, and held it to the mic. Harlan's voice again, clearer this time, sharper. "You people should stand." This time, the courtroom didn't just hear it, they felt it. The cruelty, the calculation, the racial sting tucked neatly behind a smile. Dorian waited for the silence to deepen, then stepped forward slowly. "They're not just hearing your insult," he said, turning to Harlan with quiet finality. "They're watching the consequence of it." The television anchor hadn't even finished the segment when the backlash began. Adrian Corr is exaggerating to gain social media relevance, Leonard Vail declared, leaning forward on the studio desk, his mouth set in a calculated smirk. The statement hung in the air like a challenge, one aimed not just at Adrian, but at everyone who had ever experienced silent humiliation and been told it was nothing. In homes, offices, airport lounges, and school cafeterias, the clip spread like fire. But what the airline hadn't anticipated was that the match they'd struck would land on dry timber soaked in resentment. By mid-afternoon, Adrian's name trended worldwide, not as a symbol of exaggeration, but as one of quiet defiance. People from around the globe shared personal stories of similar humiliation at the hands of airline staff. Activists, attorneys, former flight crew, and passengers added their voices. The hashtag #WeStandWithAdrian surged across platforms, reaching millions within hours. Yet Adrian himself said nothing, not a single tweet, not a single interview. He remained silent, not out of fear, but out of strategy. That silence, once mistaken for weakness, now felt more like a thundercloud gathering force. Inside Virelon's downtown headquarters, the tension was controlled but electric. Adrian stood in his glass-walled office, gazing out over the city, arms folded, saying little. Dorian Merrick, always composed, reviewed a fresh leak with narrowed eyes. "They're eating themselves alive," he said, tapping his screen. "Look at this." He turned the display toward Adrian. Internal emails from the airline's command chain had surfaced. Screenshots showing directives to flight crews to delay cooperation with legal representatives and delete any incident footage not cleared by upper management. Adrian's jaw tightened, but his tone was steady. "Chain of custody?" "Clean. We verified headers. It came through a secure tip line used by few of their own." He nodded. "Good. Get a preservation warrant." Already ahead, Dorian contacted the judge. Within an hour, the court approved the data preservation request, compelling the airline to secure and submit all related files. That same night, Virelon's forensic team quietly traced the origin of the deletion orders. Every path led to one place: Vincent Hale's personal server. Adrian didn't need to confront Vincent directly. Not yet. He waited. It was Vincent who cracked first. That evening, as city lights began to sparkle against the office windows, Vincent arrived unannounced at Virelon's lobby, escorted up without resistance. His face was tight, sweat glistening beneath his hairline. Dorian met him in the conference room, and Adrian followed moments later. Vincent tried to lead with diplomacy. "Look, we can settle this, quietly. No press. No court." Adrian looked at him evenly. "A man once told me the same thing." He smiled, just like you're smiling now. Vincent's grin faltered. "You don't want to drag this out. It'll be bad for everyone." "I disagree," Adrian replied. "It's been bad for far too long. Now it's simply visible." When Vincent pushed a folder forward, an offer with a large settlement figure inside, Adrian didn't even glance at it. "I don't negotiate with silence," he said, his voice like tempered steel. Vincent left minutes later, lips pressed shut, eyes dark with panic. Later that night, long after the building had emptied, Adrian's assistant buzzed him through the intercom. "Sir, you should see this." A small padded envelope had been slid under the office door. No return address, no markings. Inside was a black USB drive. Cautiously, Dorian ran a full scan for malware. Clean. When they opened the files, the room fell into silence. There were audio recordings, hours of them, conference calls, strategy meetings, boardroom scheming, and then a familiar voice. "This is about controlling the narrative. Discredit the man before he controls the crowd," came one line. Another, "Adrian Corr is a spark. If we drown it early, the fire dies." The final file was labeled PR Strategy. HD Adrian clicked play. Harlan's voice, unmistakable, filtered through the speakers. He looked too comfortable. I gave him something to stand for. That's what they wanted, right? Dorian sat back slowly, his hands clenched. He wasn't just a passenger. He was involved from the beginning. Adrian didn't speak right away. The city lights flickered behind him as he listened to the final seconds of the recording, where laughter echoed coldly across the table. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then reached forward and clicked to save the file under a new name, For the Truth. He leaned back, the tension in his jaw loosening only slightly, his voice calm but iron-bound as he said, Adrian recognized the voice behind one of the recordings. It was Harlan himself. He slammed his elbow into the CEO's nose, breaking it as blood dripped onto the aisle, then sneered, You people should stand. If you believe hate dressed as arrogance deserves justice, hit subscribe now, because silence only protects the guilty. The moment the courtroom projector flickered on and displayed the internal hiring form with Harlan Doss's name under the airline's Behavioral Response Division, the air in the courtroom shifted. A low wave of murmurs rippled through the spectators' gallery. Adrian didn't blink. His gaze held steady on the screen, even as whispers escalated to gasps. Dorian Merrick rose from his seat slowly, as if balancing the weight of what he was about to say. Let the record show, he began, voice taut with controlled fury, that Mr. Harlan Doss was not just a random passenger. He was a contracted consultant, specifically assigned by the airline to engage high-profile passengers under a behavioral monitoring program that was never disclosed to the public. On the stand, the airline's human resources director, a wiry man named Russell Keene, shifted nervously in his seat. His tie was too tight, his eyes darting toward the defense table, looking for someone to interrupt. No one did. Dorian took a step forward. Mr. Keene, please confirm for the court. Is this your signature authorizing Mr. Doss's involvement under something titled Project Temperance? Keene nodded after a long pause, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. Yes, he said, barely audible. But... No buts, Dorian cut in, slamming a printed report on the evidence table. Project Temperance is described here as a real-time provocation and analytics framework designed to test how influential individuals respond to humiliation, stress, or perceived injustice in flight environments. Isn't that correct? The judge leaned forward. The courtroom's silence deepened. Keene hesitated again. Yes, but it was supposed to be non-confrontational, verbal only. Any physical contact wasn't authorized. Adrian leaned toward Dorian, whispering just loud enough to be picked up by the court microphone. Verbal humiliation is still assault, especially when sold as data. Dorian nodded and turned back. Mr. Keene, are you saying Mr. Doss acted outside protocol when he elbowed my client in the face? I'm not sure, Keene stammered. The briefing procedures were vague. Only Mr. Hale had full oversight. That name, Hale, ignited the room again. All eyes turned toward the defendant's table. Vincent Hale, the airline's operations director, sat motionless, jaw clenched, watching the slow unraveling of a carefully buried secret. Let's clarify something, Dorian continued. Was Mr. Hale the one who approved the use of Project Temperance on Flight 742, the same flight where my client was assaulted? Keene gave no reply, but it was Hale's silence that screamed louder. Dorian walked to the center of the courtroom. I would like to submit into evidence a signed operations directive issued 6 months ago titled Customer Response Experiment, Phase 2. It contains Vincent Hale's signature, along with embedded clauses authorizing data capture, personnel provocation tactics, and post-flight analysis of passenger reactions. Without consent, the judge's gavel hit once. Mr. Hale, he said firmly, you are ordered to respond. Did you sign this directive? Vincent Hale stood, slowly, the stiffness in his limbs betraying the panic beneath his well-tailored suit. We were under pressure to innovate, he said, his voice brittle. Behavioral metrics are valuable. Insurance modeling, customer targeting, conflict mitigation. This was research. Research. Adrian's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. He stood slowly, one hand resting on the edge of the bench. You call this research? You hired a man to provoke me, deliberately. And when I bled, you measured it. When your crew ignored me, you recorded it. Not as human error, but as data. The judge motioned for Adrian to sit, but didn't stop him from finishing. You didn't just target me as a man, Adrian continued, his gaze locked on Hale. You targeted my humanity as data. For a long second, no one moved. Then, from the back of the room, someone stood. Elias Crane. He had been silent until now, a witness waiting for his turn. His voice was firm. And what about the others? How many more were tested like this? The judge banged his gavel again. Mr. Crane, please sit. You'll be heard in due time. The court recessed 15 minutes later, but the damage had already crystallized. Newsrooms outside the courthouse began broadcasting live updates. The term, Project Temperance, trended instantly. Within hours, online forums unearthed similar stories from passengers on other flights. Some had experienced verbal hostility, others sudden denial of service, or targeted provocations that were never explained. The pattern was undeniable. Back in the courtroom, Harlan Doss sat hunched in his chair, a shell of the smug man who had elbowed Adrian just days earlier. His hands trembled as Dorian approached him. "Do you want to tell the court who gave you your final instructions?" Dorian asked, eyes sharp. "I was following orders," Harlan muttered, voice cracking. "Whose?" Harlan closed his eyes. "Vincent Hale. He said they needed data. Told me to press hard. To push him." He gestured weakly toward Adrian. "Said he'd either break or prove valuable." That was enough. The judge ordered an immediate recess to review the legality of the airline's data collection policies and the broader implications of Project Temperance. Outside, the media had already dubbed the scandal something else, something that would stick: the standing trial. The email arrived at dawn. Adrian was seated alone in the upper floor of Virlon's Manhattan headquarters, the skyline dim behind him. A steaming mug of black tea rested untouched at his elbow. The message blinked on his private terminal. No subject, no signature, just one sentence. Stop before the damage becomes irreparable. There was no emotion in the line, no threat of violence, only the calm edge of a warning from someone who assumed they had leverage. Adrian read it once, then again. He didn't flinch. He closed the message, leaned back in his chair, and whispered to no one. So they're afraid now. A moment later, his assistant entered with a soft knock. "Mr. Core, Elias Crane is here." Adrian nodded. "Send him in. And make sure we're not disturbed." Elias stepped into the office, eyes weary but alert. The former witness had become more than a bystander. He was now a key operative in a battle that neither of them had intended to fight, but both now fully understood. "They know we're getting close," Elias said without needing context. He removed a flash drive from his coat pocket and handed it to Adrian. "My contact decrypted it last night. The metadata on that boardroom recording. It wasn't anonymous. It was routed through a masked relay, but the origin server? It's real." Adrian inserted the drive. Lines of code and node paths spilled across the monitor. "Oral Gate," Elias muttered, pointing to a designation buried in the header. "Registered to a private shell corp linked to the airline's third-party security provider." Adrian stared at the name, his mind racing. "It's a behavioral response cache." Elias nodded grimly. "They weren't just recording us for safety. They were analyzing reaction metrics, stress thresholds, vocal fluctuations, micro-responses to humiliation. It's not about bias anymore. It's about data." Adrian stood. His reflection in the glass window showed a man who had once been wounded on an aircraft and now stood at the center of a corporate fault line. "They're selling reaction profiles," he said, voice measured. "Not just mine. Not just Harlan's target. Every uncooperative executive who didn't smile when slapped." He turned away from the window. This was never about a flight. It was a lab. Elias exhaled slowly. "What do we do?" "We finish it," Adrian said. Over the next 48 hours, Adrian assembled the culmination of months of quiet fury. Every internal memo, every suppressed testimony, every deleted message, restored, verified, encrypted. He compiled it into a single secure document, one that couldn't be ignored or spun. He titled it simply, Standpoint. The final hearing approached like a storm. Adrian's legal team advised caution. Dorian Merrick urged him to wait until the federal inquiry fully launched. But Adrian knew the value of timing. "The longer we wait," he told Dorian, "the more they rewrite the narrative." The courtroom was tense. Cameras clicked. Lights buzzed faintly above the benches. Across the aisle, Vincent Hale whispered to his counsel. Harlan Doss sat hunched behind them, now silent, now pale. Adrian took the stand. The judge asked if he had anything further to submit. He nodded once. Dorian handed over the summary of findings. The opposing counsel stood immediately. "This is grandstanding," the airline's attorney barked. "He's leveraging media chaos for personal gain." Adrian turned his head slowly. "You're right about one thing," he said, voice level. "Outrage is fuel." He reached into his coat pocket, removed a compact device, and tapped the screen. "I know exactly where to direct it." The courtroom monitors flickered to life. Across newsrooms, the upload began populating. One by one, journalists, analysts, and citizens saw what had been hidden behind corporate curtains. The full archive of Project Temperance's methodology, its false surveys, its staff instructions to provoke emotional strain. Standpoint had gone public. Within minutes, headlines exploded. Adrian stood at the center of the room, his expression unreadable. "They thought standing meant silence," he said, his words echoing across the courtroom. "I stood, and the world listened." The moment the upload hit the public servers, the effect was instantaneous, like a circuit overloaded with truth. Within minutes, news outlets began flooding the airwaves. Headlines blared across screens in waiting lounges, cafes, and corporate offices. Project Temperance exposed, airline surveillance scandal, CEO, Adrian Core releases. Damning files at Virelon Technologies headquarters, the normally silent lobby buzzed with activity as phones rang off the hook and reporters gathered at the front glass doors like moths to flame. The files, titled Standpoint, contained internal memos, voice recordings, timestamps, video evidence, and metadata logs that painted a damning picture. This was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern engineered and concealed. Adrian stood at the center of the operations floor, arms crossed, watching a muted news broadcast as a panel of commentators tried to digest what they were seeing. One anchor turned to the camera and said, "This isn't just a corporate scandal, it's a betrayal of public trust." The screen split into frames of executives exiting buildings under escort, protesters gathering at terminals, and stock tickers plunging into red. "Status?" Adrian asked, turning to his assistant, Rylan. Rylan, clutching a tablet with shaking hands, replied, "Shares down 17% in the last hour. Investor hotlines are crashing. The FAA just announced they're opening a federal inquiry, and—" He hesitated. "Vincent Hale's been taken into custody." Adrian didn't smile. His jaw clenched slightly, but his eyes remained steady, absorbing the fallout like a man watching a storm he had charted long before the clouds formed. In the adjacent conference room, Dorian Merrick swept his hand over the long mahogany table as he laid out a timeline of expected legal escalations. "You've cracked the dam, Adrian." The water's not stopping. But you need to brace. This isn't the end of their resistance. They'll come back swinging. They already have, Adrian said quietly, gesturing toward a screen showing a live press conference. On it, the airline's last-ditch spokesperson, Malcolm Trent, stood before a podium, flanked by attorneys. "We have serious concerns regarding the authenticity of the footage," Malcolm declared. "Our internal review suggests that certain visual elements may have been manipulated or taken out of context." The lie was bold, but it was also expected. Adrian turned from the screen and walked to the window, the skyline of Darren City burning gold under the late afternoon sun. "They've set their last trap," he said, more to himself than the room. "Now we spring it." Within the hour, a scheduled live stream from Virulon's forensic analysts began. A soft-spoken data scientist named Brennan Keir stepped forward on screen, flanked by two digital integrity experts. Methodically, he walked through each clip, each log file, and each embedded data string, verifying every detail: timestamps, audio syncs, lens angle metadata, and even the subtle shifts in cabin pressure recorded during the assault. This footage is untouched, verified, unaltered, signed with biometric ID, Brennan concluded. To question its authenticity is to question gravity. Social media lit up. Commentators called it the most detailed public forensic breakdown of a corporate scandal in decades. The hashtag #StandpointFiles trended globally. Meanwhile, Adrian returned to his private office where the soft clicking of keyboards echoed outside his glass walls. He sat in silence, one hand resting on his desk, the other lightly brushing the edge of the wristband that had recorded the beginning of everything. Dorian entered the room moments later, shutting the door behind him. "Malcolm's team has gone silent. No counterclaim, no press response. It's over," he said. Adrian exhaled slowly, as if releasing a weight he'd held since the moment his nose had cracked under Harlan's elbow. He looked at Dorian, then down at the glowing screen displaying the collapsing stock graphs and breaking headlines. "You know," Dorian added, lowering his voice, "you could have walked away." Settled quietly. Moved on. "I didn't build Virulon to walk away," Adrian replied. His gaze lifted, eyes fixed on the reflection of his own face in the darkened glass, still bearing the faint scar from the incident. "I built it to show what happens when silence ends." Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, not from chaos, but from momentum. Agencies were mobilizing, shareholders were revolting, politicians were demanding hearings. The world was no longer watching in curiosity, it was watching in reckoning. As Rylan re-entered with a fresh stack of legal summaries, Adrian turned to him and spoke with quiet finality, his voice low but immovable, a line that would later be quoted in documentaries, etched into think pieces, and remembered in courtrooms. "Justice doesn't shout. It stands and keeps standing." The doors of the Capitol hearing chamber opened with a quiet groan, but the air inside was already tight with anticipation. Lights overhead buzzed low, dozens of journalists filled the rear gallery, lenses pointed like rifles, waiting to capture every expression. Adrian Corr stepped into view, flanked by his attorney Dorian Merrick and a federal ethics officer. He wore no tie, only a dark suit and a steady gaze. At the far end of the chamber, beneath the seal of the Ethics Oversight Committee, Chairman Roland Crest adjusted his microphone and signaled the session open. "This hearing will now resume under the authority of the Federal Ethics Investigation into Unauthorized Biometric Experimentation," Crest declared. His voice echoed through the chamber. Adrian moved slowly to the witness chair. His every movement was deliberate. The scar on the bridge of his nose had faded but remained visible under the lights, a subtle reminder of the moment that ignited everything. As he raised his hand for the oath, a hush fell over the room. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Adrian said quietly. The committee began with procedural questions, details of the flight, the timeline of events, the legal actions taken. But it wasn't until Chairman Crest leaned forward and said, "Mr. Core, in your own words, what do you believe happened on that flight?" that the atmosphere changed. Adrian took a breath, and then another. Cameras zoomed in. He didn't look at the committee. He looked into the room itself, as if speaking to everyone who had ever endured something similar and been told to sit down and move on. "I bled in silence," he said, his voice calm but charged. "Not because I was weak, but because the silence revealed more about them than anything I could have said." That elbow wasn't the beginning. It was the reveal. Murmurs spread through the gallery. Dorian leaned slightly forward, eyes locked on the committee, prepared for rebuttal. Adrian continued, his tone steady. It was never about anger. That moment was a test, and not just of me. It tested how many people would look away, how many systems would prioritize image over integrity. I sat there, nose broken, and watched the crew treat it like an inconvenience. I was the data point they were trying to record, but I chose to respond with restraint because sometimes resistance doesn't roar, it waits. A pause. Not one camera clicked. They tried to reduce a person's dignity to a metric. They called it Project Temperance. I call it moral cowardice dressed in protocol. Chairman Crest tilted his head. "You believe the program was systemic?" "I believe it was designed," Adrian replied, his eyes sharp. "And we've since uncovered evidence that similar behavioral analytics programs, under different names, were run by multiple corporations, each using biometric provocation disguised as customer engagement." A rustle moved across the chamber as a new document was submitted to the record. It was a compiled report from Viralon's Ethical Data Unit, detailing cross-industry participation in empathy analytics. Airlines, transportation firms, even private medical carriers had allegedly employed tactics similar to Project Temperance. Crest leaned into his mic again. "And you chose not to sue privately, but to testify publicly." "Why?" Adrian didn't blink. "Because silence is the first concession, and every time we let humiliation pass without response, we hand our dignity over like currency. I came here to draw a line." The room fell into stunned silence once more. Then soft applause broke from the audience section. Crest raised his hand to quiet it, though his expression betrayed admiration. Later, a different kind of witness was escorted in. Shackled, suited in a muted gray jumpsuit, and no longer wearing his leather arrogance, Harlan Doss shuffled to the stand. His hair had grown uneven. His posture was no longer defiant, but hunched from weeks of interrogation and consequence. "Mr. Doss," a committee member asked, "were you acting under direct orders when you targeted Mr. Core?" Harlan swallowed hard. His voice cracked as he answered. "Yes. I was told to provoke, observe how high-value targets react under social stress, record micro-responses, log flight reactions. Did you know it would cause harm?" He didn't look up. "That was the point," he said hollowly. Gasps rolled through the room. Adrian remained still, his eyes never leaving the man who once grinned through his pain. One final question came from Crest. "And if you could say one thing now, to this committee or to Mr. Core, what would it be?" Harlan hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed. When he finally spoke, the room hung on every syllable. "They wanted to see how far a man could bend before breaking," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "They picked the wrong man." Adrian adjusted the glass panel until it locked into place. The wristband lay beneath it, silent, ordinary, almost unimpressive to look at. Yet it had recorded the moment everything changed. In that sealed display, mounted on a walnut pedestal beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, it looked more like a relic than a piece of tech. Outside, rain traced slow lines down the glass, the city beyond blurred in a quiet haze. Behind him, Elias Crane stepped in with a file in hand. "They confirmed," Elias said, placing the folder gently on Adrian's desk. "The final settlement was rejected." They're filing for reorganization. Technically, the airline doesn't exist anymore. Not in its old form. Adrian didn't turn. He remained still, arms crossed, his reflection faint in the display case. The office was quiet, apart from the hum of central air and the occasional crackle of distant thunder. Months had passed since the trial, since Project Temperance had been dragged into the light. But the scars hadn't faded. Not on his face, not in the industry. He finally spoke, his voice low but certain. "And the board?" Elias opened the folder. "Resigned, every one of them. Government regulators are already reviewing the new leadership. Public trust is still low, but they issued a statement." Adrian turned now, narrowing his eyes. "Let me hear it." Elias read, "We acknowledge the systemic moral failure of the previous leadership and commit to rebuilding this company with transparency, accountability, and human dignity at its core." For a moment, neither man spoke. The rain outside fell harder, a soft percussion against the windows. Adrian let out a breath. "Moral failure," he repeated. At least they finally used the right words. But inside, he knew this wasn't the end. A system that had profited from silence would not collapse in a single collapse or apology. It would try to resurface, quieter, smarter, cloaked in new language. That was the nature of such systems. Still, something had shifted. Virelon Technologies, though rocked by temporary investor panic during the trial, was stabilizing. Not because of profit projections or new contracts, but because it had done what few companies dared: draw a line. At a recent shareholders meeting, a man from Gralix Equity had stood and asked pointedly, "Are you willing to risk future growth over moral crusades?" Adrian had looked him square in the eye and replied, "If your idea of growth means stepping over the line we just drew, I invite you to invest elsewhere." A few left, most stayed. Now, in the weeks since, the pendulum had begun to swing back. Quietly at first, institutional investors, long afraid of moral messaging, returned. Not for the bottom line, but for the clarity, for the assurance that integrity would never again be a footnote in Virelon's vision statement. And with that momentum came the real shift. Dorian Merrick had approached Adrian with a proposal to form an internal branch dedicated solely to ethical data governance. It would audit every project, every algorithm, every line of behavioral code Virelon produced, not as a PR move, but as a foundation. "You realize it'll slow us down," Dorian had warned. "I'd rather move slower with purpose," Adrian replied, "than sprint into another storm blind." Elias, still standing at the desk, placed a second file on the table. This one marked with Virelon's new initiative title, Echelon Ethos. He was no longer a quiet witness. He had become the director of the very system designed to prevent what had once happened to Adrian from happening again. "You'll need to sign here," Elias said. Adrian didn't move for a moment. Then he stepped forward, picked up the pen, and signed, slowly, precisely. Later that afternoon, a young reporter from the Herald Edge arrived to interview Adrian for a retrospective piece. The man, no older than 25, looked slightly nervous as he set up his voice recorder. Adrian remained calm, patient. He was used to the questions by now. "If I may," the reporter said, "there's one thing everyone keeps asking." Adrian looked at him. "Go ahead." "Do you regret taking that flight?" The question hovered in the air. Adrian leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting toward the glass case once more. The wristband rested beneath its light, silent but undeniable. He smiled faintly, not out of humor, but recognition. "Regret," he said slowly, "is what silence feels like after you choose it." The applause had just begun to fade when Adrian Corr stepped to the podium, the logo of the Dignity Foundation rising behind him in bold serif letters. The hall was packed wall to wall, former airline passengers, civil rights advocates, government officials, and men who once wore uniforms for companies that had tried to bury the truth. Some looked down in quiet guilt. Others looked up, expectant, their eyes filled with a cautious kind of hope. A year had passed since the cabin incident, yet its echoes felt sharp in the air, like pressure before a storm. Adrian adjusted the lapel of his dark charcoal coat. No notes in hand. He didn't need them. "Standing isn't always about defiance," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Sometimes it's about refusing to kneel to silence." The silence that followed was deliberate, held like breath under water. Then the crowd erupted, some rising to their feet, others nodding slowly, silently. Adrian stepped down with the same calm that had carried him through courtrooms, headlines, and threats. His stride was unhurried, not for effect but because every step meant something now. By the front row, Elias Crane waited. He stood beside a steel column, a foundation director's badge clipped to his chest. Without a word, he handed Adrian a small envelope. Adrian took it without breaking stride. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he walked through the back exit of the hall, the wind outside brushing against his face with a chill that reminded him of the morning after the trial. Camera flashes continued behind him. Security cleared the steps, but he asked them to give him a moment alone. On the second landing of the granite staircase, he paused and peeled the envelope open. The handwriting was rough, crooked, the pressure uneven as if written with a trembling hand. The note was brief. "You stood." And it changed me. It was signed, Harlan Doss. Adrian stared at the name for a long moment. His eyes didn't narrow. They softened, though not in pity, in recognition, not of Harlan, but of something far more fragile. A man realizing he had been a weapon and not knowing it until the weapon broke in his own hand. He folded the paper once, then again. He tucked it inside his coat pocket, above his heart, and exhaled slowly. Behind him, the inauguration continued. Whistleblowers were being honored. Names of passengers wronged on other flights were being read aloud. And somewhere in the building, a new hotline went live, staffed by attorneys and therapists, ready to answer calls from anyone who had ever been shamed for simply existing where someone thought they didn't belong. Adrian looked out over the cityscape beyond the marble balcony. The skyline shimmered faintly through winter haze. From above, the world looked unchanged. But beneath the surface, deep in boardrooms, policy meetings, and courtroom benches, he had felt the tectonic plates shift. A staffer approached gently. "Sir, the press is waiting for your exit photo." He nodded, following him back down the steps where camera crews braced for the perfect shot. And when a reporter asked whether he regretted taking the flight that changed everything, Adrian didn't hesitate. He gave the same answer he always did. "The elbow broke my nose," he said, his voice quiet but unshaking. "But it also broke a system built on looking away." He tried to make another man fall and ended up facing him in court, surrounded by cameras and truth. If you believe dignity always rises higher than hate, subscribe now, because justice stands taller than pride. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, arrogance, and the power of justice served through intellect and integrity, not violence. Its purpose is to raise awareness, promote empathy, and inspire conversations about equality, accountability, and respect.